Mr. Chairman, thank you very much indeed. I stand to move Amendment 1, but with it will be a whole bunch of other amendments which I have put down alongside my honourable friend, the member for Isle of Wight, and the honourable lady, the member for Rotherham. These I had intended originally, when I put these down, Mr. Chairman, to speak on the basis that the government needed to act. But since I put them down, the government has acted, and that's never a bad thing. And as I may well have provoked with my colleagues them to act, I do want, however, to speak to these because there are further consequences that come as a result of this, and things that are happening at the moment, which leads my hope that the government will pay full attention to further action that may be required, stretching across extradition and into sanctions. So I thank the government in this regard that they finally agreed to rule out the extradition arrangements with Hong Kong. But it is worth noting what has been going on since the imposition of the national security law, which is now making many in Hong Kong their lives a misery. And more than that, they now fear very much indeed, not only for their lives, but their liberty in a way that none of us here sometimes, I think, could possibly imagine what it is like to live in such an environment. You know, we have a historic relationship with Hong Kong, and we have a legal right under the Sino-British treaty to have an opinion and view on what is happening in Hong Kong, no matter what the Chinese government may say. That is our right in international law. And this imposition of the national security law, we know, runs counter to that arrangement, that treaty. And so on that basis, the government has acted correctly, I think, in cutting off any potential problem that may arise as a result of the use of that extradition agreement. But there is more. I mean, even now as we speak, quite recently, a number of people who have done nothing other than use the kind of rights that we would take for granted in this House. Jimmy Lai, the owner of the largest pro-democracy publication in the city, has been charged with undermining the state. Arrests of young activists, some of which we've seen on television, but others go on, and media posts holding blank pieces of paper at protests in shopping malls, they being arrested for sedition. The targeting of Hong Kong activists overseas is going on apace and gathering pace, and retrospectively applying the law to supposed crimes that took place before the law even came into force, which I find, well, perhaps I shouldn't find remarkable, but I do. And then there's all the elements, Mr. Speaker, which the UK government will find itself having to deal with. And I think all the devolved administrations, I believe, are united in this sense. That the effort around censorship is really quite astonishing. References now to the Tiananmen Square massacre have now been removed from all textbooks and all elements that may say anything at all about this. They are simply blanked out. A new cultural revolution with teachers and students now being asked and encouraged to spy upon each other, where somebody may say the wrong thing or something which is considered the wrong thing or in retrospect may have been remembered to have said the wrong thing. These are all would then invoke the use of the security law. And there's a new national security centre in Shenzhen to re-educate those who do not comply with these. Benny Tai, the organiser of the Yellow Umbrella protest, a peaceful movement, and I stress these are all peaceful movements, is fired from his teaching post at university simply because he was party to that movement. And censorship of university content now is also gathering pace, as they're filleting out anything that references any concerns or issues around the nature of China and even historic nature too. And then we come to the latest issue, which will concern the government completely, because we're now seeing particularly journalists from the free world. I say the free world because this is not just a Western issue. This is an issue of all those who believe in rights and freedom around the world, whether they be in the Far East or in the West. But the New York Times now has to relocate its staff completely lock, stock and barrel to Seoul after a senior journalist visa renewal was rejected, and the threat was clearly there that the rest would follow. Senior journalist of the Hong Kong Free Press had their visa rejected. And the Foreign Correspondent Club in Hong Kong described this as a weaponization of visas by China. And even on the news the other day, we now see that the Australians are being heavily targeted, brutally targeted, not only with sanctions, but now even their journalists are having to flee the country. In fact, 2 journalists were due to leave, were then stopped from leaving, and ended up in the consulate, and have now finally left. But the authorities wanted to question them for writing stuff which they didn't approve of. And then, Mr. Chairman, the whole point about this issue comes into focus because it is the cooperation of the Chinese officials that I find perhaps the most galling. The announcement that they were postponing the LegCo elections by the Chief Executive Carrie Lam, which were due to take place on Sunday the 5th of September, which is just a weekend gone. But she cited COVID cases as a reason for the delay. Now, I must say, I've heard a few excuses in my time, but this one really did take the biscuit, because so many other countries have had elections, local and national, even during the COVID saga. And it is also worth pointing out that the Hong Kong rate of infection is lower pretty much than any of the countries that have held elections already. So the idea that they can latch on to COVID as some kind of excuse for cancelling elections had nothing to do with the reality. The reality was they did not approve of the opposition, and they wanted to stop that so they had time to make sure they arrested the key elements so they would never be able to stand. And now many of them have fled here to the UK, and I have met and seen them. So there are 2 points, really, I think, that dismantle this whole process. The point I made earlier on, which is that a number of countries, dozens, I think, have actually held elections. And this is really part of the total crackdown and the acquiescence with what essentially is an illegal process going on in Hong Kong. Which brings me also to the next phase of this. The government is right to have reacted. It is right to have ceased the extradition procedures, but there is yet more that I believe needs to be done, and I like to think that this is something which unites us all. The Magnitsky amendments, the sanctions that come from this, now need to seriously be deployed by the government. They said, the government and the Secretary of State or the Foreign Secretary said, when I was last in the chamber on this, said that they would review and read other actions that need to be taken with regards to Hong Kong, and they would take it as the situation develops. I must say, Chairman, the situation has been developing. It's been developing at a pace which means that I think, if my right honourable friend will forgive me, it's at a pace faster than the government or the Foreign Office seems to be able to move. So I would urge the government and the Foreign Office, we have nothing anymore to lose by holding back on this. It's not as if the Chinese government is going to turn around and thank us for this, because they already think that we have caused problems. So my answer to this is, let's get on with this. The deteriorating situation over the summer has really accelerated, and the US government have already sanctioned Hong Kong and Chinese officials responsible for the implementation of the new law and for any human rights abuses. So I urge my right honourable friends and the Foreign Secretary, who isn't here, to move on to this and to listen to Nathan Law, who himself fled directly after the Hong Kong government did not agree to them standing. He had to flee, and others have done so too, and they've all called for those sanctions to be applied. So I do hope that the government will listen to people whose lives have been under threat, who themselves have families still in Hong Kong, and yet are brave enough to call for such sanctions, knowing full well that this may bring further problems for them. Can I also raise, related to this, another issue which is part of this process, which is the excessive and expensive visa fee costs for BNO passport holders under the present government policy, which could potentially be prohibitive for those who wish to get passports. It does seem to me that we've been generous in opening up to say that those BNO individuals who have BNO status who wish to get passports will have the right to get them and to travel, if necessary, to the UK. but we then put another problem in their way, and we don't make it easy for them. And it's sorely not right that British passport holders, but as potential passport holders, should have to face these kind of fees. So here we have BNOs that are allowed to serve in our armed forces, but yet not able to become British nationals without paying a large cost. I hope the government would think about suspending that to encourage them, and particularly the young ones, to be able to take advantage of what is essentially should be a lifeline. And many of those who I've met who have fled Hong Kong have spoken of their difficulties in obtaining those passports, and I know it's not directly my right honourable friend's responsibility, but I do hope he will raise this with the Foreign Office to give that their blessing. The last point I want to make before rounding up on this is important, that we also know that all the businesses that have been kowtowing to the Chinese government, I think in a shameful way, many of them, apologising, excusing, and saying somehow this is all about restoring order, despite the terrible abuses taking place. Many of them are listed. I won't go through them all, but I do want to raise one thing that has just recently been discovered, which is that the Disney company, it appears now, worked with the security services in Xinjiang province. Xinjiang province. People may remember that that is, of course, not province, I beg your pardon, it's a region. But that is the place that the Uyghurs have suffered the most appalling abuse. It is these very security services that have been responsible for the forced sterilization of Uyghur women. It is these very security services that have been rounding up those who have not cooperated, send them to re-education camps, which have turned into labor camps because they are now giving what I would call slave labor to companies situated in China. This is appalling, but this is an illustration, Mr. Chairman, of what has been going on in China. I mean, I'm astonished, to be quite frank, no matter all the amount of news that exists at the moment, that actually the broadcast news has been pretty quiet on this. It's high time that we actually made a fuss about this. We should be the leaders in all of this. This country has a responsibility to Hong Kong and has a right to speak out. And I simply say to those companies, Mr. Chairman, that it is shameful that they turn a blind eye. It is shameful that they act as the apologists for a regime now that brooks no dissent, intolerant, and is now arresting people for the most minor new offences which have nothing to do with normal law. So it's deteriorating. It's deteriorating fast. This government needs to pick up the pace. It needs now, after having agreed to these extradition procedures being lifted, the reality is that nonetheless, I urge my government, I urge them with all my heart to put China right up there as a priority, no matter for all our domestic rows and arguments and details, all of which are important. But the freedom of people and the imposition of dictatorial regimes should always be our number one cry. We should speak out when others are not able to have the freedoms that we take for granted in this House. And if we don't speak out for them, who will?
The question is that Amendment 1 be made. David